What's that? It's 3:16 a.m. Must be time for some space weather. Looking at the sun at 193 angstroms. We see a sunspot setting and an active region rising. Check it out. Also, we are currently in the wind stream from this coronal hole. Taking a look at 171 angstroms. There is some magnetic complexity going on. Not sure if it's a sunspot. We'll be keeping you posted though. There are the magnetic lines, 94 angstroms. Main feature here is the coronal hole. And how about the real-time solar wind? So, we do see a disconnection here with the coronal hole. No signal around the 180 degree mark there. The BT-BZ is fairly convergent now. Keep in mind negative BZs, negative BZ angle. That's an earthquake risk factor. Solar wind density is surprisingly high at 11.39 protons per cubic centimeter. Surprised that hasn't dipped down yet. However, the coronal hole wind stream is providing a wind speed of 509 kilometers per second. So, wouldn't be surprised to see the plasma density dip, and we'll be keeping an eye on the speed throughout the day. When that wind stream arrived, it sparked a G-class geomagnetic storm and sparked some serious auroras. 10.7 centimeter radial flux is 72 solar flux units. The auroras are calming down a little bit. However, if you're in Canada, go out and have a look. Next, let's look at spaceweathernews.com. Shout out to Ben Davidson for maintaining a site that we look at every day. We see the flaring is relaxing a bit. We do see a long-lasting B-class flare there. Sunspot 2733, that is. And here's the magnetometer spikes that we were talking about. Forecasted these yesterday. Has to do with the information we see on the Gong 2. And we see we are now in geomagnetic instability, as the KP5 has now dropped down to a KP4. Next, we would like to note one thing on the Cygnets forecast. We're going to be keeping an eye on this. See that? That's the Parker Solar Probe. About to begin its next dive. We see an electron flux dip as we usually do with a coronal hole wind stream. No surprises there. We do see some charging hazards over northern South America and Central America, and a little bit in the Caribbean. And the F2 layer is surprisingly discharged. Let's make sure that's up to date. It was not up to date. It's even more discharged now. Very discharged F2 ionosphere. Here are your aurora forecasts. You see there are still some pretty significant auroras happening, both at the North Pole and the South Pole. Next, let's look at geospace movies. A great opportunity to see the way the solar wind affects the magnetosphere. Here's the velocity. You're going to see some higher velocity areas here, especially on the equatorial plane view. Give you an idea of how the plasma interacts with the magnetosphere. Here's your density. You can see much denser than we've seen previous days. Again, keep in mind the light colors are low density and the dark colors are higher density. And lastly, we see the highest pressure we've seen in several weeks. It's what a stronger magnetosphere looks like. Moving on to geospace ground perturbation map. Here's the North America. Some strong fields down in the Pacific. Here's the globe. And here's the poles. And that is what happens when a coronal hole wind stream hits. Now, yesterday we did talk about the magnetometer. Let's tie that together to the Gong 2. Now, those spikes in the magnetometer that you're seeing there are the crossing of these regions. Let me just show you that in the last frame here. You see we have strong field, diffuse field, stronger field, diffuse field, strong field. That's what's happening. That's why the magnetometer spikes are there. Let that play through so you can see how that works. The other items here are stereo A and stereo B. And let's look at the synoptic ecliptic field plane plot. See if we can see what's going on with the incoming active region. Does not look like a sunspot. However, this view does give you a great understanding of these crossings occurring here. Moving on, since we got about 18 tabs. Next, let's check out quakes.globalincidentmap.com. Look at the last 10 hours. We got a 4.9 in the central East Pacific rise. Basically what we see is a lull in earthquakes here. A 4.4 in Greece and a 4.8 in Vanuatu. And a 4.9 and 4.4 in Indonesia at depth. It's about all we see. Earthquake downtick. Seems like a normal situation when you disconnect from the coronal hole. And there's the last quake of note. Right in the warning area, which was here. And now that warning should be relaxing a little bit. Moving on to volcanoes. What do we have? We got Shivaluch, little uptick at Shivaluch. 26,000 foot ash plume. Sakurajima 6,000 foot ash plume. Fuego. Continuous emissions. Reventador emissions observed. Sabancaya intermittent emissions. Planchon Petaroa 15,000 foot ash plume and possible emissions. Nevados de Chilean intermittent pulses. Let's see what's going on over at the Associated Press. U.S. Border Agency says it's made the biggest ever fentanyl bust. Nice job, guys. They've seized nearly 254 pounds, which is enough to kill about 16 billion people, I think. I haven't done the math on that. If anybody would like to figure that out, feel free. The size of a few grains of salt of fentanyl, which is a dangerous opioid, can kill a person very quickly. You want some cheap heroin? Get some cheap heroin laced with fentanyl. Good times. By the way, that same bust also seized 390 pounds of meth. We'll leave links. And also to this article at extremetech.com. The Parker Solar Probe is beginning its second orbit. Here is an article about it. If you're not familiar with the Parker Solar Probe, get that way. The fastest object ever built by man. Next, let's look at phys.org. Earth's largest extinction event likely took plants first. Is that like what's going on now? With global crop losses all around the world caused by hailstorms, late springs, and early winters? Researchers discovered evidence that Earth's largest extinction may have extinguished plant life nearly 400,000 years before marine animal species disappeared. Well, if plants disappear for 400,000 years, you won't have to worry about it. Anyway, another interesting article about catastrophe cycles. Have yourself a read. Also, some interesting information about volcanoes depositing high concentrations of nickel, one of the most toxic elements on the periodic table, into the Sydney Basin's mud rock. Next, let's look at some information about what's going on Earth right now. Is the Arctic melting? Looks pretty frozen to me. What is that? What is that scale there? Is that meters? Oh yeah, that's meters. So you can see the entire east coast of Greenland is all frozen. Thick ice there. We've got 4.5 to 5 meter thick ice in the center of the Arctic. Also, these areas full of 5 meter thick ice. Some 4.5 meter thick ice over here. When you look at the chart, this is sea ice volume, by the way. Currently kind of right in the middle of the meaty part of the range right here, the black line. However, what I would like to note is that in 2018, we see a pulse right here as spring begins. And then it takes forever to melt. We don't see an early winter on this graph, but we do see a late spring. Next, let's look at the Danish Meteorological Institute for the Greenland ice mass budget. Here you see 1981 versus 2019. Not a huge difference there. And also, this lower graph here, you see that late spring reflected, and really you see an early winter reflected, as last year ice begins to build in May and June. So as far as this goes, the Arctic is surely not melting. Now let's head to globalcryospherewatch.com. globalcryospherewatch.org, that is. Look at the snow ice cover. Northern Hemisphere is pretty snow coated right now. Here is your snow mass, and you can see snow mass is way outside the standard deviations. And lastly, here's one of the ice concentration maps for Antarctica. If anybody's able to read Russian, Cyrillic that is, please let us know what this says. However, we see ice. It looks like Antarctica is not fully melted yet. Moving on. How about a NASA GOES water vapor map? There you go. Check out South America. Man. Turbulent convergence of moisture and dry air down there. Not a surprise it's the lightning capital of the world. And now back to the sun, 94 angstroms. Take a look at that active region. Check it out. It looks like some flares might have come out of that. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll be doing it all again tomorrow. Thanks, subscribers. Please don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already done so. Press that like button. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you want us to do for the 1,000 subscriber special. We're going to have David Devine on. Remember, when you're staring at the sun, don't drink. And if you drink, stare at the sun anyway. Use the SDO. And don't drive.